And good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the annual lecture by the UK Ambassador to Japan, to the Japan Society. What really is something of an annual fixture, and I think all Japan Society members will agree that it's a very valuable annual fixture to all of us, both in terms of the information that it gives us and the thinking that it stimulates about what's been going on in Japan, but also enables us in normal times to those of you who can't travel regularly to Japan, get to have a chat with the British ambassador on his visit back. This time, of course, this is the first virtual annual lecture, and I hope that next year we'll be back in person. But Paul Madden gave our final in-person lecture event last year on March the 5th. Before lockdown happened and before we had to shift to online sessions. So I'm delighted to welcome him back. That lecture was, as has become traditional, hosted by Nomura International, and I thank them very much for their continued support. I welcome back Paul Madden to give this annual lecture. Paul has given 3 previous annual lectures as ambassador during his 4-year posting in Tokyo. So he's now well known to all of us. I'm delighted to say he was previously, for those who've forgotten, previously Britain's High Commissioner in both Australia and before that in Singapore. So I think one could say in contemporary terms that he's a one-man tilt to the Indo-Pacific. He has had, of course, just retired from the Foreign and Commonwealth FCDO, but after a very long and distinguished career there, what many people don't remember is that his career at the Foreign Office followed a spell at the Department of Trade and Industry from 1980 to 1987, including on the Japan team before he joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1987. I'm going to invite Paul to give us his lecture as always, and I think he's going to share some slides, which is also in line with his excellent previous practice. We will then, once Paul's given his lecture, we will then have a discussion, but also very importantly, welcome your questions. So with no further ado, I hand over to Ambassador Paul Madden.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and good evening, everyone. I was just admiring your rather pleasant book-lined study, Bill. I'm afraid I'm sitting in front of a blank wall because all my books are currently in a container on the high seas. I should also mention that by an unfortunate coincidence of timing, I actually had my COVID vaccine this morning. I'm really glad to have had it, and I'm feeling absolutely fine. And I'm hugely proud of what the UK has been achieving in the vaccine rollout. But I just mention it because if the questions get a bit too difficult this evening and I'm struggling with the answers, at least I've got something to blame. Okay, so let me share my screen now. So I'm delighted to be joining the Japan Society this evening, although it is for the very last time in this capacity, although I'm sure it's not for the last time. And I think, as you said, Bill, this must be the first time that the annual ambassador's lecture has been delivered virtually, rather than in the splendor of Nomura's London headquarters. But I guess for all of us, Zoom meetings have become a big part of life over the past year. So Sarah and I left Japan on the 26th of February at the end of my 4-year assignment as ambassador and on retirement from the Foreign Office after 40 years of public service. And Sarah has been very much part of all of that. My very worthy successor, Julia Longbottom, is already in the country. She's currently on language immersion and will formally take up her role very shortly. I thought that today I would give the usual summary of events over the past year in Japan and in the UK-Japan relationship, and then look forward to how I see this year shaping up. And finally, I hope you might permit me a few reflections drawing on my experiences of Japan and Asia Pacific over much of my working life. Well, I suspect that most ambassadors coming before you for the last time at the end of a posting would like to claim that the UK-Japan relationship has improved immeasurably over their period in office. Well, in my case, I genuinely believe that the relationship is in much better shape across a wide variety of fronts than it has been for some years. But I don't claim that that is down to me. But I hope that after listening to my remarks tonight, you will have a good appreciation of the very healthy state of the current UK-Japan relationship. But let's start with the thing that has dominated all else for the past year, COVID. As one of my friends said on a recent birthday, I'm not counting this year because I didn't use it. Well, for some, COVID has been a year of personal tragedy with ill health, loss of loved ones, economic damage, jobs and livelihoods, and also a sense that we're all going to be paying the cost of this for many years to come. But for many others, it was more a year of fear and uncertainty, of frustration and inconvenience. For diplomats living overseas, much of our work revolves around official visitors and hosting and attending events. And our personal lives include an expectation of being able to pop home regularly or have family to come and visit. So it's been a deeply frustrating year. Although I have to say, it has probably felt safer living in Japan during this period than almost anywhere else on Earth. We couldn't necessarily have predicted that that was going to be the case. I remember when I spoke to you last year, we'd only just come through the Diamond Princess cruise ship evacuation crisis, which was one of the first outbreaks anywhere outside of China. Within Japan at that time, there was some criticism of the way the authorities had handled the cruise ship, although I think, frankly, at that stage in the COVID crisis, we were all to some extent groping in the dark. And for some time, many of my Japanese friends were suspicious that with low testing rates, their government might be underreporting the incidence of COVID to avoid having to cancel or postpone the Olympics. But as the year progressed, the hospital intensive care units didn't fill up in the way that they were doing elsewhere. And the number of the so-called excess deaths did not suggest that there were significant numbers of underreported COVID fatalities in Japan. Well, as of last week, Japan has had only 8,800 deaths from COVID compared to 126,000 in the UK, which has about half the population. That's effectively 27 times more successful. But no one has been able to identify a single magic bullet for why Japan did so well on COVID. Like governments everywhere in the world, Japan had to balance health and economic considerations. Unlike many other countries, there was less of a worry, though, about what level of restrictions the Japanese public would be prepared to accept on their way of life. So without taking new legislative powers or imposing draconian measures on their populations in the way that some other successful Asian nations did, Japan achieved very high levels of compliance with the government's recommendations. And I don't suppose that will come as a surprise to anyone listening to this talk this evening. So Japan's relative success on COVID seems to be a combination of a number of factors. There were some good government policies around cluster busting, so tracing and closing down potential clusters. Japan also has very good underlying public health, particularly among its elderly. Obesity is only about 4% in Japan compared to 30% in the UK and 40% in America. And social practices involving less physical contact and mask wearing helped too. Japan also essentially closed its borders to foreigners from last March. And this did cause some frustration to foreign nationals who were long-term residents of Japan, often indeed married to Japanese, because they found themselves unable to return to Japan once they were out of the country, and therefore effectively unable to leave it. Many of them who had made long-term commitments to Japan and are usually among its greatest advocates found themselves being treated differently to their Japanese spouses. And this was an issue that we and other embassies actively and eventually successfully lobbied the Japanese government on. Well, the absence of foreign tourists, restrictions on bar and restaurant opening hours, and a general reluctance of Japanese consumers to be out and about had a huge impact on business sectors like hospitality and retail. For a period starting last summer, the government announced its Go To campaign to subsidize domestic travel, which proved very popular. But this became controversial when the number of cases began to rise again in the autumn. Overall, it's estimated that Japan's GDP for 2020 took a hit of around 5%. That's significant, but much less so than for many other advanced countries. It's interesting that some of the factors that helped Japan avoid the worst of the pandemic, may also be factors which have made its vaccine program relatively slower. A general caution against moving quickly in the domestic approvals process meant that Japan's rollout has started well behind others. Japan has learned some other lessons from COVID too. It realized that it was behind on the uptake of digitalization in the country. I'd personally been surprised when I returned to Japan in 2017 to find that my office still had a fax machine. And I was told that that's how some of our contacts, including some in the Japanese government, still chose to get in touch with us. In general, the Japanese bureaucracy seemed to find itself technically and culturally a bit less well equipped to make the move to working from home compared to the Japanese corporate sector. Presenteeism, the need to physically stamp documents with a hanko chop have all been challenged by COVID. And Japanese consumers too have adapted to significantly more online shopping, where again, previously Japan lagged. And I guess that many of these changes will not be reversed. So what was the British Embassy in Tokyo doing during COVID? Well, our trade and investment team, which make up around 40% of our staff, helped to lead our quest across the Asia Pacific to procure medical equipment and PPE for the NHS, particularly at the height of the crisis. And this was a more difficult exercise than originally conceived because so many leads, wherever they appeared around the region, actually eventually led back to the same factories in China. We were also making sure that companies were aware of all the various schemes the British government had introduced to support business during this period. And there was a huge appetite in London for information on the COVID situation in comparator countries, their different policies and effectiveness. So we set up quite a large team who were kept very busy on that. And we also facilitated a number of direct contacts between UK and Japanese medical and public health experts and policymakers. For example, I sat in on video conference calls between Matt Hancock, Chris Whitty, and their opposite numbers at various points. And our consular staff made sure that the Foreign Office travel website, which was getting huge volumes of hits during this period, was constantly updated with the latest information about the COVID situation and about travel and quarantine restrictions in Japan. And they were also involved in supporting individual cases of particularly vulnerable British citizens. Our economic team had a very busy year. One consequence of leaving the EU on the 31st of January was that we had to negotiate new bilateral trade deals with many third countries, and Japan was obviously a priority. It was not an easy process. It was possibly the first ever major trade deal to be negotiated almost entirely online. This did bring some advantages. Rather than having to rely on episodic visits to each other's country, the negotiators, who numbered hundreds of officials altogether, could be in permanent daily contact online. The disadvantage was that they didn't have the opportunity to go for a beer with their opposite numbers at the end of a hard day's negotiating and get to know each other's red lines more informally, which is usually part of the negotiation process. And I guess that made the role of the embassy in supporting the negotiations even more important. Foreign Minister Motegi flew to London in August in the hope of finalising a deal, but the UK Trade Minister, Liz Truss, was determined to stick it out to get a better deal. And in the event, agreement was finally reached in September, and Liz Truss flew to Tokyo for the signing ceremony. She was our first ministerial visitor for about 6 months. And in order to exempt her from the 2-week quarantine requirements, the Japanese government set very strict limits on the movement of the minister and her party whilst they were in Tokyo. So essentially, they could only be either at my residence or in Japanese ministries. But despite the restrictions, it was a very successful visit. I showed Liz Truss the facsimile on the wall of my residence of the very first Anglo-Japanese trade deal of 1613 between King James I and the Shogun Ieyasu Tokugawa. And it was nice to feel that we were making history again. Well, my sense is that the Japanese side found the UK negotiators better briefed and more robust than they'd expected, given that Britain hadn't been negotiating its own trade deals for many decades. Certainly, I felt proud to be working with some excellent Whitehall colleagues. The new agreement, known as the Sepa, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, turned out to be the UK's first new post-EU exit trade deal. It had 3 main elements. It ensured that both sides would have continuity on the market access that they'd enjoyed under the EU-Japan EPA. Secondly, it went further in some areas like financial services and digital. And thirdly, it was designed as the first step in the process of the UK seeking accession to the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, I joined Liz Truss for a very warm lunch with Minister Motegi, in which he set out his intention for Japan to use its presidency of the CPTP process in 2021 to help progress the UK's interest in accession, which Japan very warmly welcomes. And the UK's interest in CPTPP membership is not just about market access. We believe that a high quality agreement like the CPTPP with strong standards can contribute to promoting high quality agreements in world trade more generally. And this is important at a time when the open world trading system has been challenged from various sides in recent years. For many Japanese, an added attraction of UK accession would be that it might increase the prospects of the US returning to the table at some point in the future. Of course, for many Japanese companies, particularly the big makers with significant manufacturing plants in the UK, it was the future UK-EU trade agreement that was even more significant than the future UK-Japan trade deal. So they were very pleased with the UK-EU final deal announced in late December. It offered them tariff-free and relatively low-friction trade in goods across the borders. Some of you participating in today's event may take a different view, but let me give you my sense of current Japanese business thinking based on many interactions with senior Japanese figures, as I said my farewells in Tokyo, and on an excellent recent discussion I had with Kedanran's Europe Committee. I believe that there is a broad consensus that we are now in a much better place than people feared when I first arrived in Tokyo in early 2017. As one participant at the Kedanran meeting put it, it's been a long and difficult journey. I think Japanese were first surprised by the referendum result, and they were further discomforted during the period of Theresa May's minority administration, when the government seemed unable to get its Brexit policies through Parliament. Now, I think their confidence in Britain has been restored. Some companies have made some small adjustments to their UK footprint as a result of Brexit, but the vast majority have remained because of the many positive factors about the UK that brought them here in the first place. And of course, that doesn't mean that we're complacent. We know that we will have to continue to work hard to ensure that the UK remains highly competitive. Well, turning now to security issues. If economic issues are looking in better shape than 4 years ago, that is even more the case for the security and the foreign policy relationship. In February, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab and Defense Secretary Ben Wallace held a virtual 2+2 meeting with their Japanese counterparts, Motegi and Kishi. There was a very broad measure of agreement on the extent to which security relations have thickened, but also much discussion of practical steps to deepen cooperation further. During my 4 years in Japan, we saw the first ever joint exercises involving the British Army and Japan's Land Self-Defense Force. But it was in the field of maritime that we saw the most developments, with very regular deployments of Royal Navy ships to the region, and they worked closely together on enforcing UN sanctions on North Korea, for example. Not for nothing did I find that many of my Japanese counterparts were referring to a new Nichiei Dome, referring to the Anglo-Japan Treaty of the early part of the 20th century. And this year, that relationship should go to the next level with the proposed visit to the region by the UK's new aircraft carrier, HM Queen Elizabeth, and its carrier strike group. Obviously, plans for that visit are still in development, and we don't tend to talk about the details of military deployments very much in advance anyway. So I can't say much more about it tonight, but clearly Japan very much welcomes this very visible sign of the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt, which Bill referred to earlier, which was a big feature of the UK's integrated review of defence, security, foreign and development policy that was recently announced. Increasingly, our security cooperation extends to the fields of defence procurement and defence technology as well. And this has been an area of growing collaboration, and we hoped that Japan might be a potential key partner in the development of our future combat air systems, where we have, both countries have very similar requirements. In the event, the Japanese have gone with a major American partner, Lockheed Martin, but they have made clear that they continue to see scope for significant UK-Japan cooperation at the subsystem level. So, for example, on aero engines between Rolls-Royce and IHI. So what's been happening in Japanese politics over the last year? There was an historic moment in August when Prime Minister Abe stood down shortly after becoming the longest serving Japanese Prime Minister ever. As with the untimely termination of his first period in office, once again, it was precipitated by health issues. Abe is one of the few Japanese leaders whose name and face are widely recognized by foreigners around the world. Longevity and charisma enabled him to cut a dash as a statesman figure on the world stage, attending all those leaders' summits. Until COVID, it was a positive period for the Japanese economy, even if Abenomics didn't fulfill all of its promises. And although Abe never managed to amend Japan's pacifist constitution, despite having the necessary 2/3 majority in both houses, he was able to reinterpret it in various ways that give Japan more freedom of maneuver in gradually moving towards a more normal defense posture. But despite all the successes in winning elections and in office, Abe did not sustain the popularity that you might expect with the Japanese public. And COVID added to his woes, with the governors in Tokyo and Osaka able to claim that they were moving more quickly in responding to the crisis. So many people were surprised when a deal between major factions suddenly allowed Yoshihide Suga to win support for his candidacy as party leader and thus prime minister. Although he had been a very visible public figure throughout the Abe administration, giving the twice daily press conference as cabinet secretary, many people did not really feel that they knew him. Certainly on the international side, he was relatively unknown. At the Kante, his focus had been overwhelmingly on domestic issues. Personally, I had had relatively few encounters with him, for example, when accompanying British ministers on calls, but he had been one of the key pillars at the centre of the Abe administration. Well, there was much speculation that he would dissolve Parliament and call a snap election to consolidate his initial popularity well in advance of the autumn 2021 deadline. But that speculation withered as his popularity receded. The go-to travel subsidy program to promote regional hospitality initiatives was his flagship initiative. So inevitably, he took some flack when it was accused of having contributed to the second wave of COVID infections. True to form, Suga's initial focus has been on domestic policy reforms, particularly those with the potential to provide early direct benefits to the voters, for example, by reducing mobile phone bills. He hasn't done much on the international stage so far, apart from a visit to Southeast Asia and his big announcement on climate change, which I'll say a little more about later. But perhaps that's hardly surprising that he should have such a strong domestic focus in a COVID year. So some suggest that Suga really needs a successful Olympics and Paralympics to ensure that he stays in office, and that explains why the Japanese government remains strongly committed to going ahead with the postponed games this summer, as of course does the International Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Of course, a decision to cancel the games, since further postponement would look impossible, would involve both a huge loss of face, but also writing off huge amounts of government and corporate investments. According to polls, about 80% of the Japanese public think that the games should be postponed or cancelled. But that's not so abnormal. Polling in Olympic cities like Sydney and London just before their games showed a lot of public concern about cost, inconvenience, security. But as I'm sure those of you who are in London at 2012 will recall, once the games began and the host nation started winning medals, the populations quickly swung behind the event. And I'm sure that will happen in Japan too. When Prime Ministers Johnson and Suga spoke on the phone in February, our Prime Minister offered Britain's support for a successful games. I think my personal sense is that although some uncertainties remain, it's looking much more likely now that the games will go ahead than it did several months ago. Of course, there will need to be adaptations, many fewer spectators, and as we recently heard, no foreign spectators, and strict controls around the movement of athletes and so on. But I think if any country can make those sorts of process issues work, Japan can. Of course, all the investment that Tokyo has put into making its public transport system more disability friendly, for example, will not be wasted. It will be an enduring legacy. But I'm sure that the Tokyo Paralympics will also have the effect, as it did in London, of making people more aware of and more understanding of their disabled fellow citizens, helping them to think more about what people can do rather than what they can't do. The other event that was disappointingly postponed last year was the Japanese Emperor's state visit to the UK. My final official act as British ambassador, the night before we flew home to London at the end of February, was my official farewell audience with the Emperor. Obviously, one can't talk about the detailed nature of those exchanges, but as you can imagine, His Majesty is looking forward to making his postponed state visit as soon as the circumstances permit for both sides. So looking forward, what are the big challenges and opportunities for Japan and for the UK-Japan relationship over the course of the year ahead? Well, I've already mentioned the Olympics and the Paralympics and the postponed state visit, and these should keep my successor Julia very busy. And both countries will be dealing with the vaccine rollout and how to begin to address the financial consequences of COVID as their economies begin to revive. Japan will be very involved in a couple of key areas where Britain is taking the lead this year. Attending the G7 summit in Cornwall in June will probably be Prime Minister Suga's first major summit in person. I think that Japan and the UK are very much on the same page on our G7 priorities of health, economic recovery, and climate change. And I think we'll both be keen to stress the important role that open societies with democratic systems can play in addressing those challenges. I'm conscious that I keep saying we, meaning the British government, and I suppose that still makes sense as I'm talking about the past year, for 11 months of which I have been the British ambassador. But I realize that in future, I'm going to have to start talking about they instead of we. No doubt some of my former colleagues who are on the line will tell me that that's liberating. Personally, I think it's going to take some getting used to after 40 years in government. The other big international meeting that the UK will host this year is the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, in November in Glasgow. And if I'm honest, this was the one area, major point of difference in approach between Britain and Japan for most of my time in office. Japan had been a backmarker on committing to carbon elimination. They emphasized the challenges for a country with no natural energy resources and which had had virtually all of its nuclear capacity knocked out for now as a consequence of the 2011 Fukushima disaster. The voices of the industry were strong, particularly with METI, and the countervailing pressure from public opinion and NGOs was relatively weak. And this was despite the fact that even during my 4 years in Japan, we had seen an intensification of extreme weather events, floods in Kyushu and Shikoku, typhoons in the Kansai, and heat waves, as elsewhere in the world. The charismatic and energetic young environment minister, Koizumi, who is always tipped as a future leader, was saying all the right things, but at this stage in his career, he lacked the clout in cabinet to deliver them. So, Prime Minister Suga's December announcement that Japan would commit to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 was a huge but very welcome surprise. We sensed almost overnight the tone of the officials we met in Kasumigaseki changing. Japan was now keen to become part of the solution, not a blocker. So why did Suga change his mind? Well, probably the imminent arrival of a green Biden administration in Washington was key. But Japan was also wary of being left behind by the announcement China was making. And there was also a growing sense that with Japan's industrial and technology prowess, there would be economic benefits of being a leader in new carbon-free futures. Of course, we still want to see Japan going further in the run-up to COP26, particularly on its shorter-term commitments on NDCs, and also in committing to withdraw from coal, both domestically and by ending the building and financing of new coal plants in third countries. And this is all important, not just because Japan is a very major economy in its own right, but also because it's looked up to as a model by many countries, but particularly in Asia. Well, I also generally use these lectures to give you some snapshots of my personal travels around Japan over the past year. That's been more restricted by COVID this time, but I'm pleased to report that, as I predicted last year, I have managed to complete my quest of visiting all 47 prefectures during my time as British ambassador. My 4 final prefectures completed in 2020 were Akita, Wakayama, Miyazaki, and Okinawa. Okinawa was particularly fascinating. The subtropical environment reminded me in many ways of my time living in Southeast Asia. And I learned about the proud Ryukyu Kingdom, a significant trading power, until the islands came under the influence of the Satsuma from Kagoshima in the early 17th century. I paid my respects at the Peace Memorial Park and Museum, and I learned more about the terrible suffering, particularly of the civilian community on Okinawa in the closing stages of the Pacific War. I also visited various US bases there, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps, and learnt about their role in helping to keep the peace around the region today. And they were all very enthusiastic about the UK's growing engagement in theatre. Another interesting visit last year was to the island of Hirado in Nagasaki Prefecture. I'd wanted to go there for a long time, as it was one of the places that William Adams, the Miura Anjin, had lived. And it seemed particularly appropriate to do so in the 400th year of his death. It's a beautiful place, very well preserved. Indeed, it was quite cut off from the mainland until a bridge was built in about the 1970s. You can visit the house where Adams lived and a graveyard on the hill above the town where a monument bears his name. And a group of experts, drawing on DNA and other evidence, have just determined conclusively that the remains of a body in that graveyard are indeed Adams. Well, to mark the 400th anniversary, a group of British and Japanese history buffs, the William Adams Club, funded a sculpture in his memory, which was erected at the embassy in November. Since no images of Adams survive, it was decided that rather than have an imagined statue of the man, we would go for a symbolic sailing ship with billowing sails carved out of white marble. I think it looks very impressive. Personally, I was also very interested to visit, while I was on Hirado, a number of sites associated with the Kakure Christian, the Christians who went undercover for over 200 years after the practice of Christianity was banned by the shogun, and they only emerged when the Westerners returned in the mid-19th century. Sarah and I also had a wonderful trip to eastern Hokkaido. We saw some of the most beautiful of Japan's many lakes, like Mashuko, which is featured here, also Kusharoko and the Goko 5 lakes of the Shirotoko Peninsula. And standing on the shores of that peninsula, looking across to Kunashiri Island, is a reminder of just how close the Russian presence feels in Japan. Well, on one hike, we came across lots of signs with dire warnings about wild bears. And some other signage implied that the way to keep these at bay was with those little bells that Japanese hikers wear attached to their persons, creating a charming tinkling noise as they walk. Well, we didn't have any of those little bells, so not wanting to be eaten alive by a bear, I turned to Spotify on my mobile phone, and we wandered around the hills to the glorious peal of the bells of Gloucester Cathedral. Well, I hope that as this is my last one of these lectures, you will permit a few reflections on my 4 years in office and also lifetime engagement with Japan. As you may have heard me say before, my interest in Japan was first sparked by winning a study tour to the country in 1983 in a Gaimusho essay contest. I then learned Japanese at SOAS and the embassy's Kamakura language school, and first served in Tokyo from 1988 to 92. It was the fabled bubble economy era. Some of my younger staff occasionally asking, well, what was it like to be in Japan during the bubble period? So I always say that it felt like Tokyo was briefly at the center of the world. Decades of economic growth and rapid increase in the value of the yen meant that Japanese companies were pouring overseas and snapping up assets, acquiring companies, and Japanese citizens were traveling abroad as never before, as tourists and in students. Kokusaika, internationalization, was in the air. And at the time, Britain, relatively uniquely in Europe, welcomed those Japanese investors. And we still see the fruits of that today, with Britain playing home to some 40% of Japanese investment in Europe. It was also a time when many young Brits like me made their way to Tokyo to begin their careers, or at least their international careers. Many of them married Japanese. Some stayed on in Japan, and it was good to see them again when we went back there. But others came back to the UK, but retained a lifelong interest in Japan. And I suspect there will be quite a few of those among the audience for this lecture this evening. Returning to Japan after 30 years, many things still felt familiar, and we were pleased about that. There was not quite the same economic buzz, but Japan remains a rich, prosperous society. When I was a first secretary working on trade frictions in the 80s, I would not have imagined that 30 years on, UK-Japan trade would be more or less in balance. The neighborhood feels a bit more unstable with the rise of China, the aggressive posturing of North Korea, and ongoing territorial disputes with Russia. Relations with Seoul also took a turn for the worse after the arrival of President Moon. But Japanese citizens continue to lead safe, secure lives that make them in many ways the envy of the world. The effects of the aging, shrinking population are less visible in Tokyo and the great cities, but they're certainly there when you get out into the countryside, a reminder of some of the challenges that Japan will face in the decades ahead. And I was a little surprised to see how many of my younger colleagues had chosen a single life, or if married, not to have children. I think it was in 2003, for the first time, that the number of pet dogs and cats in Japan first started to outnumber children. Well, earlier on, I talked about some of the events that were cancelled last year due to COVID, like Tokyo 2020 and the Emperor State visit. And of course, that was disappointing. But I can still look back to many great experiences during my time in office. We often talk about football, or soccer as the Japanese would call it, as being a game of two halves. I like to think of my time in Tokyo as being a game of 3 quarters and a quarter. 3 glorious years and then a rather different one. When the Showa emperor was succeeded by his son in 1989, I was just a young diplomat standing on the streets of Tokyo, waving as the cavalcade went past. When the current emperor was enthroned in 2019, I was driving to the palace with Prince Charles to attend it as British ambassador. And I felt a unique privilege that this once-in-a-generation event happened on my watch. The Rugby World Cup, also in 2019, was a triumph for Japan as hosts and in the performance of their team. It was pretty good for the British ambassador too, with 4 teams to support and with England making it to the final. And Japan's hosting of the G20 meant many visits by the Prime Minister and many cabinet colleagues. I've been lucky to play host to many British VIPs, royalty, ministers. Maybe another time I'll tell you about singing karaoke with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary. But also sports stars, musicians, dancers, and scientists, and thousands of ordinary people who play their role in the links between our 2 great countries. Well, I'm sure that my successor, Julia Longbottom, will have many great experiences in Tokyo too. I was absolutely delighted when she got the job. We've been good friends for over 30 years. Julia knows Japan well and will be a great ambassador. And it's really good that finally we'll have a female ambassador after all those bewhiskered men whose black and white photographs hang on the walls of the residence in the library at the residence in Tokyo. It's quite an honor to take on a role that's been around since 1859 with so many distinguished predecessors. And I was always very conscious of that. This probably sounds a bit dramatic, but in handing that baton on to Julia, I really felt that I was passing on a sacred chalice, which I know she will cherish and respect, as I've always tried to. So I'm moving on. I'll be advising some companies and perhaps doing a bit of writing and teaching, but I will definitely be staying in touch with Japan and the Asia-Pacific region, where I spent so much of my working life. So I'm afraid you haven't seen the last of me. Well, my last few months in Tokyo were more fun than I'd expected. During COVID, I'd been trying to write some poems reflecting on favorite places in Japan. And the collection, entitled Fried Octopus Instead of Sticks of Rock, was published in January. I've never written poetry before. Some would say I still haven't. But it was a great experience. You can find it on Amazon Kindle if you're interested. It was briefly, well, for a couple of days, if I'm honest, the #1 bestseller in the category of English language poetry books on Kindle Japan. Frankly, I suspect it was the only book in that category. I also decided to do a series of tweets about my favorite Japanese things, not just places, but activities, arts, food, and so on. I chose to do 39 tweets because the numbers 3 and 9, sankyu, can be another way of saying thank you. And it proved popular beyond my wildest dreams. I added some 25,000 new followers, with many of them taking trouble to comment and reply. For example, I tweeted about chopsticks. I mentioned that it was sometimes frustrating after 40 years engagement with Japan and Asia to be asked whether I could use chopsticks. And this attracted lots of replies. And they split into two types. One group apologized profusely. They said, Ambassador, I am so sorry for the rudeness of my fellow countrymen. The other group took a more technical approach. They said, Ambassador, I've looked at the photo and studied your finger technique carefully, and I can confirm that you use chopsticks very well. Well, the Twitter campaign even got picked up by several TV networks who broadcast features about the tweeting ambassador. And I realized that this was partly due to COVID. People just had more time on their hands to peruse the internet. But also in Japan's state of emergency, they were less able to get out and travel and enjoy life as much as usual. So my tweets were a reminder of some of the great things about their country that they would eventually get to enjoy again. One thing that intrigued me was how many people posted comments expressing pleasure and surprise that a foreigner should love their country. To me, it wasn't surprising at all. There are many things to love about Japan. Like my own country, it's not perfect, and there are some things I would choose to be different, but on balance, I like Japan a lot. Well, my final tweet was of Mount Fuji. When you're in Japan, it's always there. A reassuring presence, a symbol of Japan. Sometimes it appears in the background, sometimes in the foreground, but a reminder that it will always be part of your life. And that's how I feel about Japan. Thank you very much.
Marvelous, Paul. Thank you very much. I apologize that your comment about Mount Fuji immediately made my dogs bark, which must mean that they particularly also felt that they wanted to be there. Thank you for that tour de force and tour d'horizon of your 40 years as well as your 4 years and the last very different sort of year in Japan. But I want to, sorry to bring this to a close, but it's been a wonderful hour and a bit with you, Paul, and thank you so much for giving us such a splendid tour of your time and of your thoughts about where things are heading from now on. I've resisted asking you for predictions about either who are going to get the gold medals in the Olympics or about who's going to be the Prime Minister of Japan by let's say the end of next year. But we'll have plenty of chance to do that privately when you come to Japan Society events in the future. And we all look forward to seeing a lot more of you in the UK than we've been able to necessarily while you've been in Tokyo. So welcome back. Thank you so much for giving us a wonderful evening. And thank you to all of those who participated for all your excellent questions. And I wish everyone a wonderful evening. And again, thank you again and see you soon.
Thanks very much, Bill. And thanks everyone for joining us. Bye.